Even with the impending threat of a major seismic event, San Francisco continues to grow, the population surging. High-tech research centers are being built in the Mission Bay district. The 1906 quake, now just a memory.
We've been in what geologists call a seismic shadow for nearly 100 years now, in which we've had only one seismic event above a 6.0. We appear to be emerging from that shadow. Earthquake activity in just the last few years in California indicates that we may be heading for a more geologically active period. And that's an ominous warning sign.
There was no warning before the 1906 earthquake. No preparations. No evacuations. Most people were lucky to escape with their lives. The rebuilding of San Francisco is messy and painful. There is no FEMA to hand out checks to survivors. Where would they get the money to rebuild? What story would the East Coast investors believe? Some call it the Great San Francisco Cover-Up. Revisionists set out to rebuild a city that is still on shaky ground. With the city in chaos, it is time to deal with that other messy issue: Chinatown.
Chinatown was demolished by the earthquake and fire, certainly by the fire, because the buildings were so substandard and so comprehensively made of wood. The Chinese left in their thousands, crossed by boat to Oakland. The burghers of San Francisco, who were largely Irish and Scots, did not want them back.
Ever since the arrival of the Chinese, city leaders have tried to get rid of them.
The Chinese wanted to come back. The leadership of San Francisco said, well, if you do come back, you can live in an unpleasant area down in the southeast of the cities.
Plans are published for a new Chinese community at Hunters Point.
There was this debate, and some felt that, hey, we can't move them out because we're going to lose all the taxes, like the poll taxes and also the property taxes. So let's not move them beyond the boundary of the county, just move them outside, away from San Francisco.
City officials debate, but no decisions are made.
The Chinese had their own plans. Never mind what you want to do to us. We're going to build anyway. And they came back, and as a matter of fact, building record shows that the Chinese applied for the most building permits within the first couple of years after the earthquake.
Before you could rebuild, you had to clean. So first thing they did was to fix the trolley tracks as best they could so that they could roll all the debris down to the waterfront, load it on the barges, and dump it out in the middle of San Francisco Bay.
In 1906, they primarily dumped the debris in a swamp north of the city. 15,000 boxcar loads from the Palace Hotel alone. Today it is called the Marina District, made land which shakes more easily in an earthquake. Very dangerous to build on, this area will be severely shaken in 1989 and suffer considerable damage.
There were many, many bodies in those buildings, and when the crews cleaned, they didn't bother to pull bones and human remains. Underneath that ground there is the ashes and debris of the old city and the bodies of somebody's grandfather.
The lifeblood of San Francisco is commerce, and businesses need to rebuild quickly, including the 37 banks that were all burned down. During the firestorm, large banks put their money and documents into fireproof vaults, able to withstand temperatures up to 1,800 degrees. But vaults exposed to the fires must cool for weeks before they are opened, or risk spontaneous combustion. Banker Amedeo Giannini didn't have that problem. His small Bank of Italy had no vault. When the fires approached, he took immediate action.
Giannini had all his cash in his bank, and he also had a relative's wagon and horses, a produce company, and he put the cash in the wagon He put the oranges on top of it, fearing thieves, and he drove a back route to his home in San Mateo. And then 3 days later, after the fire ceased, he took that money back. He set up his office on a plank over 2 barrels and then started loaning money.
While larger banks wait for their vaults to cool, Giannini begins making loans.
He also was wise enough and aggressive enough to charter 2 or 3 sailing vessels to sail north to Seattle and Portland and come back with shiploads of lumber, and that started the rebuilding of San Francisco.
In the coming years, Giannini's bank expands statewide. By 1930, it is reborn as the Bank of America. Today, this history is part of one of the largest banks in the world. But local money isn't sufficient to rebuild. Eastern banks are hesitant to invest in a city that nearly destroyed itself. San Francisco businessmen need to spin the story.
Their take on it was, let's concentrate more on the new San Francisco, the new city that will arise. You know, we're rolling up our sleeves and we're going to build a new city. And it's going to be more beautiful than the city before. We're going to do it right this time. And they got away with it. Their positive spin was taken up and believed, the darker story ignored.
Just 1 week after the quake, the San Francisco Real Estate Board passes a resolution stating the phrase, "The Great Quake," will no longer be allowed. It is now known as the Great Fire. You can rebuild a city, but you can't undo a potential disaster. Interlaced earthquake faults still slice through the Bay Area. City officials dig through the ashes and search under the rubble to count the dead. The death toll is officially set at 478, a number small enough to make investors secure, but a burial of the grim truth. An accurate death toll will remain hidden for many years.
There had been a lot of debate about how many people had actually died. The story has long been that the coroner had counted 378 bodies and they added another 100. The official death toll was voted on by the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1907 at 478.
But given the scenes of destruction, there are doubts, extreme doubts about the accuracy of that figure. Newspapers at the time reported over 1,000 dead. The fires spread so quickly after the quake that no one knows how many people have been trapped and burned in the conflagration. Temperatures in the fire zones reach 2,000 degrees, easily hot enough for cremation. Though San Francisco spends decades in denial, there is one resident who still seeks the truth, a librarian in the city archive named Gladys Hanson, who began her search in 1968.
People would come in and say, "Do you have a list of those that died?" 1906. They didn't ask for how many died, they just asked for a list because they were trying to trace a family.
But there is no list, just the total from the Board of Supervisors.
I said, oh, well, we got to believe what our Board of Supervisors tell us. They're always right. So it's easy. I will only have to search for 478 names. So that was the beginning of my project.
Gladys Hanson searches newspapers, obituaries, and mortuary records. She counts every fatality listed and makes certain to eliminate duplications. Very soon, her list jumps past 478 and then spikes above 1,000. After researching for 40 years, her death toll passes 3,000, and it continues to move higher.
I wish I could say, oh, you know, maybe by next month I'll have a real good list. I don't see this project being completed for years to come, only because there's always another avenue to go down.
If it took 70 years to determine the death toll in 1906, when the next one hits, we might be counting these new dead for a century. But none of that mattered in the mad rush to rebuild just after the quake. All over San Francisco, construction begins in earnest, continuing night and day. When building supplies are scarce, bricks are cleaned and reused.
In a year or two after, almost every block in town had construction on every site. It was a builder's boom. It was an engineer's boom. It was an architect's boom.
The city insists that new buildings must be constructed and braced to withstand an 8% lateral load, responding to shear forces of wind or moderate earthquakes. In addition, they mandate that within a downtown fire zone, all buildings be made of incombustible materials, and they forbid unreinforced masonry buildings. But these codes don't last.
After a few months, the contractors in town said it was much too severe and they couldn't possibly build things in time. So the building code was abolished.
Without building codes, contractors do whatever they want. The fire zone is forgotten, the shear force requirement is ignored, and cheaper unreinforced masonry buildings sprout up like weeds across the city. They build for more than half a century without any regard for seismic concerns.
And so a lot of the Bay Area, or a lot of San Francisco, was built with very little building code. And we'll pay for that.
These potential death traps still lurk in the shadows of today's high-rise structures. The death toll in the coming big quake will be staggering.